Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me all the way from the Netherlands with these. I think that's the benefit of these new virtual settings due to the coronavirus. We can more easily collaborate across the world. So I'm very happy that I'm able to join this session today, and I'm very thankful for being able to present the topic to you about AI for auditors. And how AI actually will audit the impact profession. My webcam is above my actual computer screen, so I will not be looking most of the time directly towards the camera. Hopefully you don't mind, because my slides are pretty are presented here on my screen. By a short introduction, so I'm Van Praten, working in KPMG in the Netherlands. There I'm responsible for everything that has to do with AI auditing. And that means that we are using AI solutions to actually execute certain audit procedures, but we're also specialized in how to use, how to audit AI solutions that our clients more and more start to use. And today, I'm happy to share some more details about that from both. I will be giving some examples from my daily practice, as well as more from a theoretical point of view. What does AI actually mean for us auditors? And I'm happy to be able to present that to you today. So I think it's always good to at least get to a certain level to understand what AI actually means, because it's quite of a container term, to be honest. But if you zoom out a bit, then it pretty much consists of 5 different components, 5 technologies that underlie AI technology, and I will shortly go through them to give a bit more sense on what AI actually is. And I think one of the most common ones that you most likely pretty much all know is everything that has to do with supervised learning. That means that you're using input data to learn certain characteristics from the data, certain interactions in that data, and from that you will be trying to make, for example, predictions. And one very obvious use case using this technology is to for example, classify images, so to determine, a very simple example, whether a dog or a cat is shown on a certain picture. So that would be like one specific technology, supervised learning, and that's actually what we quite see a lot in the space of AI technology. In opposite is what you could say is unsupervised learning, and that can be used to actually look for patterns in the data as well, but then you don't know yet what you're looking for. So you just have a large amount of data, and then you want to, for example, identify which groups of customers do I have and how do they relate to each other. So do, for example, people with a certain age want to buy certain car brands more than people with another type of age category. So market segmentation is one of a very clear example on unsupervised learning. You want to cluster the data in certain groups, but you don't know yet what you're looking for. Then one that I think we all know as well is everything that has to involve around natural language processing. So if you take, for example, your iPhone or your Samsung mobile phone, you're actually able to speak into your phone, and then it automatically recognizes what you're saying, and sometimes it also is able to actually understand what you're saying. For that specific way of working, natural language processing is being used, and that's also typically considered as an AI technology. Then those 3 are pretty much known and quite common. The other 2 are a bit more difficult to understand, and they are also not yet that spread out across the actual being used by organizations. And one of them is what we would call expert systems. And those are mostly being used in the healthcare environment. So if you look at doctors, for example, they use decision support systems to actually guide them into decide, for example, how should I treat a certain patient based on the symptoms that the patient itself is describing. And then such a doctor can actually use information from an expert system to determine, okay, based on the symptoms, what is the best possible treatment that I can give. But those expert systems are actually based on large amounts of input data, scientific articles, earlier experience from other doctors, those kind of things. And because of the complexity of all that data in such a system, it also can be considered as artificial intelligence, because you're not really anymore able to really understand how the interrelations between those data are actually shaped, and that's what makes it difficult to understand, and therefore it's also typically considered as an AI type of system. And then lastly, you have what you could call constraint satisfaction. Specialists may also recognize it as I'm looking for the word, reinforcement learning. And what it actually means is that you are trying to optimize towards a certain problem by mathematical trial and error. So it's not trial and error in like the actual sense, like in the physical world on the streets, for example, but it's trial and error on a mathematical way. And I typically give the example of traffic light optimization. So think of quite a busy crossing, and you want to optimize the traffic flows across that crossing. Then you can actually use reinforcement learning to determine what's now the optimal way how the traffic light should work in order to optimize the traffic flow across that crossing. And that's what you do with in a mathematical fashion. So you can calculate over and over what works best, and based on that calculation, you can actually come towards an optimal situation. And that's what we could call reinforcement learning or constraint satisfaction. And that's also typically being considered as an AI solution. So all these technologies, just putting here the tip on the iceberg, are actually also impacting us auditors. But first, it's good to actually see, okay, what is then the common similarity of those technologies, and you can actually divide it in like 3 typical characteristics. So in each example that I gave, you'll have heard me saying that data is one of the key aspects. So if you look at AI, pretty much always there's somehow data involved, sometimes directly for training, sometimes for optimization. It really depends, but typically data is always being used when creating AI solutions. Then the same goes for there's always a certain of learning involved. So based on trial and error, based on historical data, based on knowledge from the past, you're trying to see if there are trends, if there are correlations in there that can be used to actually make predictions, for example. So that's what we would call like the self-learningness. And you also always want to look for input-output relationships. So from the input, can it derive towards a certain output? And sometimes it can be very difficult to actually understand that relationship between input and output. And that's what we call the so-called black box problem. So you don't really understand how a certain outcome is derived. And actually for us auditors, that's quite a challenge, but I will come to that a bit later. And then lastly, a typical characteristic of all these technologies is that it's being used for some sort of decision making. And that's what you would say that the impact actually of those systems is increasing over time. So more and more what you see happening is that these advanced technologies are being used in the day-to-day practice, and that is then automatically more impactful. And that also means that we as auditors should do something with it. But then obviously it's interesting to consider, okay, what does that mean, these new technologies, for us auditors? What should we do with it? And you can actually make a distinction into 2 different aspects. The one would be, how does AI actually comply to certain standards? How do we know for sure that it works properly? How can we rely on the outcomes? How do we know that it's not discriminatory, for example, or if the predictions are accurate? So that would mean for us as auditors that the AI solution itself will become a subject of the audit. We need to, as auditors, determine whether the quality is accurate, all these kind of things. So that's definitely one aspect of how AI is directly impacting us auditors. We, especially within the space that of IT, we also now need to be able to actually form an opinion of how these AI solutions work. And I will, in my next 2 slides, will give a bit more disclosure on how that actually works. Then the other thing is, how can we actually use AI as auditors to do our work better? Because I was describing these technologies, you can optimize certain challenges, you can make certain prediction, all these kind of examples. And that actually helps us auditors to do our job way better than we did before. And the second part of my presentation will focus on that. How can we as auditors actually use these technologies better to do our work more optimal, more efficient, more specific, better, all these kind of things. So the rest of my presentation will focus around these 2 topics, and I will start on the left-hand side. So how should we as auditors actually look at those AI systems if we want to get a certain comfort if they're doing it properly, yes or no? And then first, it's important to think of, okay, when should we actually start looking at an algorithm or an AI solution? When is it actually critical for us auditors to look at it? And then it helps to look at it from three perspectives, so to say. First one would be, what's actually the complexity of the algorithm itself? So I'm focusing here on AI solution, and then if you're using AI solutions, the amount of errors that can be made is much higher than your traditional IT system, which is fully being programmed by human beings. So if the complexity increases of an AI solution or an algorithm in general, then it's automatically becomes more important as auditors to consider to start looking at it. So that's definitely a factor to consider when you want to determine, should I as an auditor look at such a solution, yes or no? The second one, and I think that's why it's also put here in the middle, is one that's most important. So what's actually the power of the solution itself? So does it actually impact the rights, duties, powers whatsoever of individuals or groups of people? So if the impact of a certain AI solution is at a certain level, then it automatically becomes important for us auditors to start looking at it. If it's not that impactful, consider an algorithm which helps an elevator to go through the different stories of a building and to optimize that process, then the impact is a bit less than, for example, an AI solution which determines whether you're getting a mortgage, yes or no, or whether you'll be getting access to a certain service by an organization which you want a service from. So power is really a factor here. And then lastly, what you could consider is the level of autonomy. So what we definitely see happening in practice, and I work on a daily basis with AI technologies, both from the perspective that I was describing, what you see happening is that those systems are getting more and more power, also from the sense that human involvement is getting lower. So automated processing of decisions is especially done with AI solutions more and more. And once it's fully automated and there's no what they call human in the loop anymore, then you can automatically say, okay, it's important for us auditors to really start looking at it as well. So what I'm trying to say with these three factors is, based on a combination of these three factors, as an auditor, you can really consider for yourself, are these now the type of AI solution that I should start looking at, or is the impact, for example, not great enough to spend my time on? So hopefully with these three factors, it can help you to determine, okay, is it important enough for me as auditor to start looking at it? And then once you made the decision, okay, yes, I am going to start looking at it, the question then arises, but how should you do that then? And this is becoming a bit more theoretical, and I'm trying to keep it a bit high level. You have pretty much 4 types of approaches that you could follow that actually are quite similar to what we are already doing as auditors. So one thing that you can do, and I'm now focusing on the boxes on the right-hand side, so the 4 boxes on the right-hand side, what gives the least comfort, but what at least says something about the environment in which those AI solutions are being developed and are being used. So for example, the organization that you are working for, how are we actually building those AI solutions and how are we using those? You want to evaluate what you could call the entity level controls, which means how, for example, does an organization ensure that the right people are working on those AI solutions, or that we are fully aligned with the regulations in terms of privacy, for example. All these factors are managed at an enterprise-wide level, and that's why it's important to also look at what we call then the entity level controls, to ensure that when algorithms are being built and being used, that it's actually overall in a controlled fashion. So that would say something about the organization in general. Then, if you want to look at specific AI solutions, individual AI solutions, then you should consider a combination of different approaches. And those are the bottom 3 boxes. So what you could definitely do is actually start to testing the model itself. And that's not so difficult, and I'm not trying to make it too specific, but it's not so difficult than, for example, looking at an automated control or an application control, because you actually want to evaluate the design and the implementation. So how was the model, as it's called here? So model is similar to algorithm. how was it designed, what should it do, what are actually what's the purpose of the AI solution, and was it actually being built in accordance with that design. The difference with, for example, an automated control is the way how a AI solution is being developed. And that's what as I describing it in my first slide with the different type of technologies. You're using input data for training, for example, and you're using advanced statistics and mathematics. So as an auditor, you need to be equipped to actually understand that way of working. But the line of thinking with looking at design and implementation is not so different than what we are used to do as auditors, only the way to look at it. So what do you actually need to look at? That is different. So you need to have the knowledge about that as well. And I will end up with that in my presentation a bit later on. So what are then actually the competencies that you should have as an auditor to do this properly, yes or no? But in the basis, it's similar to what we are used to, only yeah, the real details are fully different, and you need to be equipped as an auditor to do so. Then what I said is it's pretty much always a combination of audit approaches. So what you could definitely incorporate in your audit plan when you want to look at an AI solution is to investigate what does my organizations or the organization that I'm auditing, what kind of monitoring controls are put into place around the specific AI solutions to actually monitor the outcomes, to ensure that if there are any like unwanted outcomes, certain outliers, certain risk arising, how is it actually being monitored by the organization itself? And do they have procedures in place to follow up when it's required? So that's definitely also an aspect that you want to, be looking at. And then lastly, you want to combine that with what we would call also, I think, a common known term in audit lingo, substantive procedures. So what we typically do as well is that we are going to look at actual transactions or predictions of a certain AI solution to determine how were they generated. And sometimes they're difficult because it's, for example, a black box where you don't know the exact input-output relations. But you can, if you do it properly, can really see how a certain outcome is derived. But this is everything that has to do with focusing on what should we do as an auditor to look at AI solutions. But the second part will be about what actually does it mean if we as auditors can use these technologies to do our job better. And that's actually a trend that we see happening. We sometimes are still used to actually look at it from just testing controls, testing samples of those controls to determine were those controls actually being executed in a proper way. But that is not really fit for purpose anymore, at least not all the time. So you see a trend moving towards using actually advanced data analytics or more easy data analytics to actually really validate how the organization itself has been executing those controls. So that's something that you really see that the audit profession is improving and using more and more advanced technologies for this. So we all know pretty much, I think, just using traditional data analytics, what you could call basic analytics, like queries on ERP systems like SAP and whatsoever. But you can also use actually artificial intelligence for it more and more. And it's no real rocket science. If I look at where we currently stand with using advanced or using data analytics to, and I will get to the examples on my next slide, to do our job as auditors better, then only 10% will be the actual advanced type of analytics, so using AI solutions. If I look at where we currently stand, then it's for 90% still looking at trend analysis, using certain business rules like queries I was describing, or doing certain some kind of benchmarking, or some kind of like descriptive analysis, so really determining how certain transactions were being processed. So think of process mining, for example. So it doesn't have to be real rocket science directly. You do see a trend that it becomes more advanced, but it should never be a goal. You should really start looking at, okay, how should I approach my specific audit object, and what kind of advanced or not so advanced analytical method can I use to actually form an opinion of a certain audit object. And yeah, you can use many many technologies, and I think this is one of the key slides. So I want to go through it in a bit more detail, and I think we have still some time for that. So that's good. So if you look at the top row, those are already the ones on the left-hand side of my previous slide, right? So the 90% of what we are currently doing. So, for example, descriptives and dashboarding. So you want to look at, you just want to be able to explain or understand better how transactions are running through an ERP system, for example. So you'll be using a certain query to align certain transactions to see if, for example, three-way match has been properly being used to determine whether the purchase order, the goods received, and eventually the invoice, whether they are aligned, and you can actually use dashboarding for that. And that's already similar a bit to making reconciliation. So if you want to look at the goods movements, for example, to see how were the goods actually transacted through a certain system, yeah, you want to reconcile that towards also the subledger and eventually the general ledger. And you can actually use reconciliation data analytics to ensure that that whole picture makes sense and that in between no transactions or money are lost, or any type of other reconciliations that you can think of as an auditor that you should do. But using pretty much traditional data analytics, you can really, yeah, ensure that you have a more detailed look on those specific transactions. One thing that we also do quite a bit with data analytics, and pretty much all organizations want to know how do they compare to their competitors in the same market space. And with data analytics, it's quite easy to do benchmarking because you'll be using the same analytics for different organizations. And then you can look at, okay, how do they compare against each other? So benchmarking is definitely, for us auditors, a way to look at certain processes across different organizations, but also within one organization to, for example, compare different years against each other. So do I see an improvement, for example, in comparison to last year, looking at certain transactions, or do I see a decrease, for example? That's typically what you can do with benchmarking. And then business rules is also an example. It pretty much is the basis of the three examples that I gave before. You can actually program certain rules to determine, do I, for example, observe journal entries that are unexpected, that were manual, that may be fraudulent because they were happening at a certain moment in time or whatsoever. So you can actually implement business rules in your analytics to determine if there are any anomalies that you want to follow up. So those are still quite straightforward, not too difficult. The line underneath becomes already a bit more challenging. So trend analysis, do you actually can forecast where it's going to? Do I observe a certain trend? I already mentioned it during benchmarking, but that aligns with the trend analysis. Do I see a certain trend in my company or the company that I'm auditing, where it's going? Is it improving from a term of control, from a control perspective, or is it decreasing? And with trend analysis, you can actually see that trend going on. Hopefully you all know process mining. That's a technology that we've been using quite a bit now in the Netherlands. That's really now at the stage where it's fully mature. And there you can actually go in much more detail than your descriptive analysis. And you can actually look at the log files of the systems being used by the organization to determine how do all the transactions run through the process, and do I see certain transactions fall out of the typical processing. And with process mining, as long as you have the audit logging, that's typically something that can be still a challenge, then you actually can go in much more detail there. So process mining is something that's definitely helping us auditors to do our work better, because we can go in way more detail and we can go to the individual transaction to see what has happened and what has happened there. So much to do around that topic. And that pretty much aligns a bit with as well the anomaly detection. And there it already becomes a bit in the AI space, because there, based on the data that you will get from your organization or from the external organization that you're auditing, you want to see, are there any outliers, unexpected journal entries, unexpected transactions that do not fall within the bigger group. And that's what you call the anomaly, and you can use AI solutions actually. So that would be the unsupervised. So do I see certain groups And do I see certain unexpected groups? In fraud analysis, this is, for example, a good use case. So you want to identify those potential use cases, potential fraudulent transactions, and with anomaly detection, that's definitely true, and that would typically fall in the unsupervised learning example that I gave before. And you can also text analysis. That's a bit, I think, less common. It's more from a due diligence perspective to look, for example, at contracts to understand those better. For us auditors, it's maybe a bit less obvious, but yeah, you can definitely use it to see, for example, in contracts whether the agreements were right, yes or no. But I think it's a bit less obvious. And then on the last bottom is really where it becomes more advanced. I was describing the anomaly detection. If you take it to the next level, then you will be actually clustering all those transactions for further investigations. So, for example, to look at, again, fraud detection, or to look at how certain transactions were following a certain process, then you can use cluster analysis to determine a certain group of transactions, and some need to be followed up and some do not need to be followed up. That's also using unsupervised learning technology, but then you can actually gain that insights as an auditor. Same goes a bit with decision trees. So you want to identify, again, certain steps were made to come to a certain conclusion. And that's what you've been using this decision trees for. That's also an advanced technology in AI solutions. But again, and then you can observe as well those outliers to be followed up. I'm almost there with these examples. And then last two would be in the bucket of supervised learning. One would be actually doing a regression analysis. So you'll be able to predict with a certain precision, does this, for example, individual transaction has a certain a certain risk of being inaccurate, and what's actual percentage of that being the case. So that would call a regression analysis. So you would be able to score it on a scale from 0 to 100, for example. And then lastly is what we would call predictive classification. Definitely the case of the supervised learning. So you want to determine, if you put a transaction in an AI solution, is this transaction now accurate or inaccurate, for example? Or is this control being executed properly, yes or no? And that's what you could definitely do with the predictive classification, so the supervised learning technologies. But if you zoom out a bit from an audit perspective, then it's definitely the case that you do see the most use cases to date still at the top levels. But more and more you see some investigations going on using AI solutions. But it should be, and that's my conviction, never be the goal. It should always be helping you as an auditor do your work better. So never focus only on using AI. Just consider, how can I do my work better with these technologies as input. And then my last slide, and I will keep it short here because also in sake of time, and we want to at least have some time for questions. What does it mean for you as an auditor? It means that you need to be equipped for the future, and that means that you need to, for example, improve your data science skills, or at least understand all these technologies that I just gave some examples of. You should be able to really understand what they mean, and what do they mean for you as an auditor from both the L-WINM assurance perspective, as well as how can I use them to do my work better. You also see that our clients, so external organizations, or as an internal organization, your own organization, are more and more agile and data driven. So their way of working is not like subsequential anymore, but it's now iterative and agile. So you also need to be able to adapt towards that way of working as an auditor, and as an auditor itself, you also need to use that way of working more and more, for example, with continuous auditing. And then obviously you need to be artificially intelligent, so you really need to know what AI is. You need to have a broad interest in technology, so that means technology savvy. There's missing a V in here, but technology savvy, you really need to be interested in the topic. And it would require, and that's something that's, I think, now going on. It's still lagging behind a bit, if you ask me, but it's still going on. There need to be new standards, new way of working, aligned across the entire audit profession. How do we want to use those new technologies? And also, what do we want to do when we want to audit such a technology. So that would really require that we're also going to go to a new standard as auditor. So consider, look at yourself, saying, okay, where do I currently stand, and should I, with everything that Frank said in the past half hour, where should I focus on? What should I do? What do I think is important? And I'm challenging you to really start working on this, because this is, I believe, really our future, and we really need to be equipped for it. And I'm hoping that if any, I can answer some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Frank, for the presentation. Thanks a lot for the participants as well. Actually, we will start question and answer session right now, and we have already have some questions already posted and published through the chat. If you have any questions, please let us know. So I'll start. Actually, today I have also Mr. Alper, head of consulting in KPMG Turkey, and also at the same time Frank. So I'll have some questions today's session and I would like to start with Mr. Alper. First of all, what kind of technologies, AI technologies or intelligent automation technologies, that can the organization use, and also for the internal auditors, how can they use these technologies within their environment in terms of controlling, and at the same time, how can they use the mechanisms for controlling the environment?
Thank you very much, Tizgin. Thank you very much, Frank, for the very good presentation to summarize all these new technologies, how we're going to apply it. Actually, I would like to also touch some of them, answering this question. Let me start, Tizgin, with what happened with these COVID-19 processes. Still, we are facing the pandemic issues, and also all around the world, the business is redefining. According to our last, survey with the CEOs, as KPMG International did, it has been proved that the COVID-19 has been the catalyst for much needed digitization. 85% of CEOs say COVID-19 has accelerated the digitization of their operations and creation of next generation operating models. With the acceleration of this digitization process, it has seen that there are changes in many areas. This creates the need of act together with strategies in terms of smart automation, data analytics, and modern workforce. Especially these three important topics will be defined again, and the companies will look into these new three topics. So, what is the expected changes in this new role? Let's say so. Remote work is getting much more common. So one of the important topics that as internal auditors that we have to care about it. We know that in the world 30% of workplaces are empty. So that shows us that the remote work is getting much more common, and it will be increasing again in 2022. Another thing that I would like to mention is the increasing automation, including the digitized systems and processes, cloud-based services, robots, and AI platforms. There will be more common, as Frank, gave the examples how we are going to use in our processes. So the redesigning of risk management because of those things. These all expected changes will affect our work to do. What I mean by that, so the first, second, and third business transactions, so when they are, occurring, so we will be creating our, transactions daily, monthly, whatever it is, even we can do ongoing, monitoring works, to identify these transactions, business transactions. Especially till now, it was dependent more to the business user, but we can say that we can separate it from the user, okay, with the AI using the machine learning systems, and checked all these transactions around going on in the business, and if it's necessary, we can put this, let's say these problematic, let's say the transactions in front of many users, that has to be traced more. So I can say that we can see more people, more machine learning instead of people and people involvement to identify these business transactions to trace it more. Let me answer like that, Sezgin, for now.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Actually, I would like to have another question for Frank. So right now in our organizations, artificial intelligence, algorithms, cognitive computing, robotic process automations actually are being used already in our platforms and organization and systems. And some of them maybe quite new, some of them already implemented in our systems within some organizations. But at the same time, we are going to use these technologies for auditing purposes as well. So what do you suggest? I mean, what would be your suggestion for internal auditors if their organization is new to intelligent automation in terms of first level and second level controls, for example, when they use artificial intelligence in their business operations and at the same time for the internal control environment? How can they start and where they can start from?
Yeah, so my recommendation would always be to start small and with an actual use case. So what I've learned from experience is that it's not, you should start, just begin somewhere. Don't start with the most advanced use case maybe. And this goes both from the two perspectives that I was describing. So both from the perspective of using AI as well as Auditor, as well as auditing AI. Just pick an example where you believe, and the business is really open to actually have it audited. Just start with them, working with them to see how can we actually as auditors, and that's not really then performing an audit, but you can at least work together to see if you can somehow create an audit approach for yourself to start looking at that solution, or start exploring yourself with one use case where you could say, okay, this is an actual control, for example, that we are testing, or this is a certain process that we are auditing. How can we use a specific AI technology for that? And you can, can talk to your competitors maybe even, but my real recommendation would always be start small. Don't start with an overall training for the entire audit population and then go from there. Just start with some people that are interested in it, that have a feeling with it, and go from there. That would be definitely my.
Actually, with relevant to this subject, I would like to have a very quick question for Frank. While you collecting the data for AI technologies, what kind of ethical values that should be considered in the environment? I mean, we are collecting the data of some organizational data and also personal data at the same time. What kind of ethical things that we need to consider?
That obviously the interesting thing is here that it really depends on your organization itself. So it depends per organization what the ethical values are. So from that perspective, I would always recommend to take that as a starting point. So what do we believe is ethical, yes or no? And you have many frameworks available. So if you Google on the internet, then you have all those principles on accountability. So do we know where the data is coming from? But also quality, obviously. Are we using data that we are allowed to use? So are there any certain sensitive attributes from individuals like gender or age or whatsoever, which we are not allowed to use? But it really depends on the organization that you work for, how far they want to go. So always the starting point would be the discussion, what do we believe is ethical, yes or no? Because it really depends per individual and per organization. So it's not like a one type solution that you can follow there.
Thank you so much, Frank. Actually, I would like to also have one more question for Mr. Alper. While we are auditing the new technologies, AI technologies, or if we have the AI technologies within that environment, what kind of risky points that we need to consider in terms of using these technologies? What kind of control environment that we need to apply and we need to put a governance in our organization?
Okay, this is a very important question, Sezgin. Thank you for asking that, because instead of using people, we will be starting using the robots, process automation and also AI, the machine learning things, instead of using, employees or other, human resources. So that instead of making mistakes of the human, so robots or the processes or the AI can make some mistakes also. But what are these risks with that when you compare with the human itself? So the important part comes with the who codes this, robots in the AI and the machine learning things. Okay, it's important to have these following the processes, international processes, like SDLC processes. So if you follow those, processes, I mean the development processes, then it will help us to decrease the mistakes that we are going to make when we develop this new emerging techs. Okay, because our expectation is to done by the robots, the process automation tools. Then when you compare with humans, so it will be decreasing the mistakes, when you're talking about that. But on the other hand, we should be caring about the cybersecurity. So if there is no involvement of human, if there is a computer involvement that we are discussing for, then cybersecurity is an important subject. Its cybersecurity, approach strategy should be built on the company's strategy and also should be applied to the below of the processes, not only internal audit itself, all the target operating model that we are going to run with the new company strategy. If these two are well organized, and cybersecurity, the process optimization and the SDLC rules, those things, then you will be decreasing the risks that we will be facing with the new world. Okay, this is the important part I would like to mention. The cybersecurity is still very important, and we should be care about for all company, not only our internal audit processes, is also for the company. So these, sometimes companies forget this, that the process itself also should fit the cybersecurity approach and also the all preventive rules that we are going to write over there. Mm-hmm. So the business process should also support the cybersecurity projects going on in the company in order to eliminate those risks or mitigate, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Actually, I mean, just to wrap up the answer for the cybersecurity part, maybe we need to consider the authentication and authorization, and at the same time for the correction and the integrity of the algorithm, maybe that the robot use, maybe. So that's why the governance part for the algorithm and the authentication and authorization part for the user account that the system use is an important for our environment. Actually, we have lots of questions, but at the same time we are running out of time. Maybe we can also take these questions, and maybe we can also come back to you in a written way. Mr. Selim, maybe we can close the session just not to have any other delay for the other sessions.